Welcome to part 3 of my review of my coverage of the misinformation inflicted on the public regarding prescription opioids, and we're dealing with a more serious issue this time, overdoses. To get us into it, let's start with one of my Lord Killian videos, A Response to America Undercover. I had to debunk a lot of these same myths yet again and provided even more sources to back them up. And after you finish watching this one, you'll see how this idea that overdoses are the results of prescriptions really doesn't make any sense.
The United States is in the throes of an opioid epidemic.
No, it isn't.
Some are calling it a public health emergency.
Yeah, complete rubes who believe the manufactured crises the government and a complicit news media shove down our throats. I've already gone over the reasons why the opioid epidemic is a complete myth, so I'll just link to those instead of going over it yet again.
Opioids are a class of drugs that act as powerful painkillers.
In fact, they're the only true painkiller on the market. Others are indirect. Aspirin and ibuprofen reduce pain by reducing inflammation. Acetaminophen is a COX inhibitor. Gabapentin reduces neuropathic pain by inhibiting calcium channels. Only opioids work directly on receptors on the neuronal cell membranes.
According to the CDC, since 1999, almost 400,000 Americans have died from an opioid overdose.
Whenever you hear this claim, listen closely to the language. He said opioid overdoses, not prescription opioid overdoses. They'll talk about prescription opioids, but then as soon as they talk about overdoses and deaths, they'll drop the word prescription and talk about all opioid deaths, including black market fentanyl. You even saw that directly here in the quote pulled on the screen. Here's a reality check for you. When you get a prescription opioid like hydrocodone, they come in a pill that also includes acetaminophen. A typical dosage is 5-3-25. That's 5 milligrams of hydrocodone with 325 milligrams of acetaminophen. A fatal dose of hydrocodone, in other words the LD50, is 375 milligrams per kilogram. In a typical 70 kilogram adult, that would be 26¼ grams, or over 5,000 pills. The LD50 of acetaminophen is 800 milligrams per kilogram. For a 70 kilo adult, that's 56 grams, which would only be 150 pills. You'll die of acetaminophen poisoning after taking less than 1/30th of the pills you'd need to die of hydrocodone poisoning. So where's all the moaning about acetaminophen overdose? Why does that get ignored? If prescription opioids are killing all these people, surely the acetaminophen's killing a lot more. Actually, acetaminophen poisoning is responsible for about half of all acute liver failure cases in the US, so maybe they should be talking a little more about this.
In 1980, 2 doctors published a 1-paragraph letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine. The letter said that in over 10,000 patients taking opioids in a hospital, only 4 patients with no history of addiction became addicted. The doctors concluded that despite widespread use of narcotic drugs in hospitals, the development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction.
And so it is. We keep seeing the same figure for addiction. It's generally between 1 and 1.5%, because those are the people who have the underlying problems that drive addiction. And I don't care how many of you keep sending me threats and other nasty things because of it. I'll keep saying it because it's true. I don't care how much it hurts your widow fifis. Addiction is not a disease. It is a symptom. People do not become addicted just because they swallowed a couple of pills. In fact, the addiction rate for prescription opioids is less than 1%, about half of what you'd expect it to be, because most people who take them are not driven by whatever underlying problem is pushing their addiction, but by a desire to reduce their pain levels. Almost everyone who gets prescribed opioids from a doctor never becomes addicted.
Remember, the 1990s were huge for the drug industry. Also for the Spice Girls, but at least they went away.
Seriously? You want the drug industry to go away? So you want to torture pain sufferers? You want AIDS patients to die instead of being able to manage their condition? You don't want cancer treatments or antibiotics or vaccines? Oh, let me guess. This is one of those I was only joking kind of situations. Give me a break.
The 1990s also saw a rise in reports of chronic pain. As a result, drug companies began manufacturing opioids at rates that would make El Chapo proud.
Yeah? Well, you know what? Good! But nice job comparing companies that provide a valuable product for millions of people with a criminal drug dealer. Any other bits of poisoning the well you want to do?
Folks, I'm starting to think drug companies might not be in it for the little guy.
See, this is just more anti-capitalist crap. Drug companies are providing a valuable product that people want. Remember that with every voluntary transaction, both sides gain. The pharmaceutical companies understand this. These America uncovered morons don't.
In 2017 alone, 191 million opioid prescriptions were dispensed.
See, he's talking about prescription opioids now. When he talks about death rates, it's just opioids, without the word prescription, meaning he's including black market deaths.
The overpriced U.S. medical system.
My opioid prescription is like $3 a month, so shut your stupid mouth, you spoiled brat socialist!
There's also the gateway drug problem.
Oh my God, how many times do we have to debunk this stupid gateway theory? Again, the only reason a pain sufferer would move to hard street drugs is if your beloved politicians take their pain medicine away.
This often occurs because heroin is both cheaper and is easier to get on the street than prescriptions from a doctor's office. In studies, 80% of heroin users report having used prescription opioids first.
And then weren't allowed to get them anymore. Again, hope you're happy.
In such a sea of depressing news, it's only natural to look for the villain of a situation, someone who deserves the blame. In the 1980s and 90s, Purdue came to prominence for developing opioids such as OxyContin.
I've completely destroyed the claims about Purdue Pharma too, and this guy provides nothing new, just mindlessly repeating the same nonsense, so we can skip the entire rest of the video. Yes, over half of the video was devoted to that witch hunt. Let me ask you something. Who's gonna sue the politicians for killing millions of people by waging this insane war on drugs? They're the ones responsible for all these deaths, but nothing ever happens to them, does it? We'll get to Purdue Pharma in part 4, but for now, let's finish off this part with another edition of the podcast from 2019, and there's good data in this one too. It covers an article from Skeptic magazine about how this intellectual manipulation is achieved. First, it's a correlation-causation fallacy. And not even that, because the years of the steepest rise in opioid overdose deaths are the same years when prescriptions declined. It also goes into the psychology of addiction. So much of our public policy, from drug policy to mental health, is based on the mistaken notion that addiction happens because you take a pill. And that's just not the case. In addition, the disease model of addiction leads everyone astray, and you'll hear experimental evidence describing that. Have a listen and just wonder to yourself what kind of person could possibly defend this. We've debunked the myth of the opioid epidemic a few times, and now we can do it again thanks to an excellent article in Skeptic magazine by Raymond Barglow. As he points out, drug overdose is now the leading cause of death in Americans under the age of 50 and is responsible for a lower average life expectancy. Basically, everything government has done to prevent this problem has just made it worse, as usual. Barglow points out 3 big mistakes the drug warriors are making, and the first is the ever-popular mistaking of correlation for causation. As we covered in the past, even the CDC claims that drug prescriptions are what's driving the problem, but their own data shows that just isn't true. In fact, since 2012, the death rate from opioid overdose has skyrocketed while prescription rates have actually fallen. Barglow points out what listeners of this podcast already know. The culprit is actually strong opioids such as fentanyl and carfentanil, which are 50 to 5,000 times as potent as heroin, and are easily available on the black market. They're easier to produce than heroin because you just make them in a lab. You don't even need a grow operation, and it's a lot easier than cooking meth. But even back when there was a correlation, that still doesn't mean that the one causes the other. Barglow points out, quote, "The correlation between prescription and overuse of opioids is no more causative than any number of treatment-illness relationships. Surgery, for example, typically makes a patient more susceptible to infection, a fact that supports more attention to sanitizing operating environments, but doesn't justify a reduction in the number of surgeries. Similarly, taking birth control pills slightly raises a woman's chances of contracting cervical or breast cancer, but this happens sufficiently rarely that it provides little reason to forego this method of contraception. The solution that continues to find favor among legislators, enactment of prescription reduction rules that are insensitive to the complexity of medical pain treatment issues, has proven to be not only largely ineffectual, but also medically unjustified. The consequence of too strict prescription requirements is the abandonment of many patients to their suffering. Deprived by their physicians of the pain relief afforded by opioids, they are motivated to look for a solution elsewhere. The second is the fact that they just don't understand the psychology of addiction, which, as Barlow points out, has actually been studied down to the molecular level. Quote, research on the behavioral and biological dynamics of addiction shows that supply restriction may actually strengthen addictive habits rather than suppress them. Paradoxically, when the supply of an addictive substance becomes risky, intermittent, or limited in some other way because of a police crackdown, for example, the consequence is sometimes an increase in the craving that holds the addiction in place. This occurs not only in the case of substance misuse, but in other human risk-taking activities also. Compulsive gambling, for example, is similar to drug use in that uncertainty of outcome is apt to reinforce an addictive habit. And the third mistake is overlooking the social psychology. Barlow points out how the disease model of addiction can be just as misleading as the just say no approach. Quote, many of those who are addicted can succeed in diminishing the harmful consequences of their drug use and sometimes in halting that use altogether. In the 1960s, about 20% of the U.S. soldiers in Vietnam became addicted to heroin, but when they returned home, more than 95% stopped using the drug. Further, these veterans were able to stay clean, provided they did not re-enlist and return to the war. Their high rate of recovery is in keeping with subsequent research indicating that addiction can be remedied by a change in environment. In previous studies carried out in the 1960s and 1970s, solitary rats had been placed in small cages and given access to water containing addictive substances such as morphine or cocaine. The animals soon prioritized consumption of this water and drank enough of it to kill themselves. In the rat park experiment, however, rats inhabited a shared environment consisting of a roomy cage providing many amenities, nooks and crannies that the animals could explore, balls and other toys to play with, and places to hide. In this socialized situation, they overwhelmingly preferred ordinary to drug-laced water. Many subsequent studies have confirmed the hypothesis that rodents living collectively under low-stress conditions do not become substance addicted. So what does Barlow say we should do? Quote, Portugal, for example, decriminalized illicit drug use in 2001 and then funded addiction treatment programs and a public information campaign. Education about drug use became part of the standard Portuguese high school curriculum. These policies have helped reduce the country's per capita drug mortality rate, which today is about 50 times lower than that of the U.S. And maybe add to that, stop torturing pain patients! Maybe one of these years someone in government will actually listen to what the experts are saying. Well, if you're outraged by this, and you should be, it's only going to get worse. In Part 4, we'll cover the fear-mongering that's designed to manipulate people into turning off the logical part of your brain and make decisions based on emotional panic. It's also used to bully people like me who are just pointing out the truth. Stay tuned.